Next, I'd like to call to the stage Brian McGuigan, who is the Manager of Aboriginal Policy with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot, Policy Advisor of the National Coalition of Chiefs.
I want to start by acknowledging the traditional territories for the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish and the Musqueam nations, and thank everyone for the warm welcome we've had here today. And I know everybody's complaining about the cold here. I live in Calgary and I'm really glad to be here in the warm weather. I think it was minus 35 this morning at home. We're going to talk a little bit about economic reconciliation and a little bit, I think it relates really strongly to the conversations we've had already this morning. So economic prosperity and economic reconciliation in Indigenous communities. Right now, from what I'm hearing, is pretty much completely absent from the conversation on how to advance reconciliation. It's like it's in a separate box. There's economic development policy over here, and then we're having this really important conversation over here about reconciliation and how do we advance reconciliation. And part of the challenge that Heather and I have been talking about is, those are really closely related things. And we've heard a little bit about economic development and economic prosperity. JP Gladue spoke really, really eloquently this morning about the importance of that in his communities and in his life and in his family. But why is it important? And part of the reason that it's important is that's where the success is happening. That's where there has been advancements in reconciliation, not just now, but in the last several years. Over my career, I've represented governments, federal, provincial governments, First Nations governments, and industry. And I don't mean this as a criticism. It's very difficult for government to be able to make tangible change in communities. And it's a long-term process. Negotiating a modern treaty or settling a land claim, developing policies and programs to overcome the legacy of residential schools. Those aren't things that happen overnight, and they're really difficult things to be able to advance. One of the reasons that I think economic development and economic prosperity deserves a really important place in our reconciliation dialogue is because economic development can create change today. It makes change. Sometimes you can see the change happening in communities within a month. We heard JP talk about the importance that jobs had in his family as his family moved forward. So economic prosperity, jobs, new businesses, it gives people hope and it changes lives straight away. It helps to solve a lot of those challenges that we see in some communities are dealing with real poverty-driven issues. Why is that important to us as resource developers? So I represent the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. It's important because this is the strongest contribution most of the members of our association make to reconciliation. It's not the only one. There's a lot of engagement around environmental issues, around social impacts of projects, and opportunities as well. The strongest contribution is around economic engagement. Oil sands companies alone, JP had some numbers up, 3.3 billion procured in Alberta from Indigenous communities. The oil sands companies alone, on average, procure about $1.8 billion per year from Indigenous-owned businesses in Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and further east as well. Those kinds of contributions drive significant change in those communities and drive really positive change. It's part of how we see, from our industry perspective, taking action on Call to Action 92 with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So I'll hand it over to Heather.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for having me here. I just want to begin by saying it's been my privilege to work with Delcy Monkey, the President of the National Coalition of Chiefs, these past few months. I don't speak for the National Coalition of Chiefs, but I'm very much passionate about their mission, which is to defeat unreserved poverty by promoting development. But I've also been on the Saskatchewan First Nations Economic Development Network Board for the past 8 years, and my research has really focused on Northern and Indigenous development, which I think about a lot, but I've also thought about UNDRIP more recently and what UNDRIP has to say about and means for economic development. And we've focused on FPIC and consent and vetoes, and you see from the questions we had this morning on Slido, that's the top of mind for everyone. But UNDRIP actually mentions economic development and economic rights 14 times. And economic rights and economic development are well-established human rights, it's treaty rights, it's constitutional rights, and yet that is also something else that has been missing from the conversation. In general, for Indigenous people, the current legislative policy framework is not conducive to doing business. There are so many barriers, structural barriers, legal barriers, doing business on reserve in Indigenous territories, from the Indian Act especially, but from the history of the past system to restricting trade, agricultural trade, and it just has gone on. And I hear many chiefs and many communities complaining that they can't do business at the speed of business, that there's so many different barriers and bureaucracy that they have to go to. And so I wonder, how does UNDRIP, this UNDRIP legislation, affect those barriers? Does it help or does it detract? And right now I have to say with Bill 41 and the way that Bill 262 was drafted before it wasn't passed, and it probably will be reintroduced soon. Right now there's a lot of uncertainty actually. I think it creates uncertainty for investment in Indigenous territories and on First Nations non-reserves. And I wish that the bill had been drafted more clearly, less vaguely, all the questions that the people had up there. I wish that the legislation had taken care of a lot of those questions, that didn't have to go to courts and impose time delays, resource delays, human capacity delays. At the same time, I remember that in 2004, when duty to consult was affirmed, people also thought, well, this will create delays and uncertainties and will affect business, and it did, but I think we all know that also created an explosion, really, of impact and benefit agreements and training and education and employment. So I'm hopeful that at the end of the day, this UNDRIP legislation can help, and the clearer and faster we can make, provide certainty for investors, for First Nations, for chiefs and councils, the sooner. And it's not hypothetical, it's happening in real time here with Coastal GasLink. What does the legislation mean for the ability of some people to say no and some people to say yes? So thinking about that, I think what we need to focus on is not just being able to provide the right to First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities to say no to development, which is important, which is their inherent right, but also to be able to make sure that they can say yes to development, that our policies and our legislation and our structures allow them to go forward with development if that is what they want. And so JP, mentioned procurement, the mandate letters, the 5%, lots of set-aways, set-asides, the work that's been done with the oil sands. What else can we do to reduce those barriers and create opportunities so that First Nations and other Indigenous communities can have a better chance at saying yes to development, doing development? And I think that's what the National Coalition, the Chiefs, is working on. And I think that's what everyone wants. But we just kind of need to refocus the conversation, I think, on being pro-development and always focus on the ability to say no.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.